Hello, my friend. How are you?
I'm good, Mark. How you doing? It's great to see
I'm
you.
doing I'm doing really, really well. So I want to thank everybody who's joined us and those who will join as we go through this hour. Um, First, I wanted to just thank you all for making the time because I'm not using the language of a new normal because I don't think that we've actually been doing this long enough for it to be normal.
Mm.
I really do see it kind of as a moment of transition and reflection and constantly moving parts. But I do know that I am still certainly as busy as I ever was, whether I'm going physically into the office or not. And I'm sure that's the case for a lot of the people on the call today. So I just wanted to thank everybody for making the time to be with us. Um, Also wanted to just take a moment to pause and acknowledge for any of you who may be directly impacted by COVID-19, that you or a loved one has been dealing with the virus, or a colleague, a community member. We just wanted to acknowledge that and also to offer our heartfelt condolences if indeed you are someone who has lost someone, either in your immediate family or community as a result of COVID-19 or otherwise. And just know that our prayers and our thoughts are with you. Just a brief note about how these conversations have evolved. So as we made the transition from working in person to working remotely, we started to think about, well, what could we offer and who do we know? And what are some of the topics that people are asking us about? So we started with a conversation with Karen Diefendorf from Tyson Foods. She's the director of their chaplaincy services there. And what lessons could we glean from the work that the chaplains at Tyson do on a daily basis to support employees during this time? And we also had a conversation last month with Jane Hyun of Hyun and Associates around cross-cultural communication, as well as the aspect of xenophobia that's rising, particularly against Asian and Pan-Asian and those perceived to be Asian in the midst of the pandemic. And this would normally be the day that we would be having our Religious Diversity Leadership Summit. Our gala is tonight. We're actually doing a virtual gala, but this would kind of usually be the day where we would have our speakers come in and various panels. And we were already scheduled to talk to Arno with the theme of the world around us, and really trying to bring in the idea that addressing religious diversity in the workplace, as we've been saying for many years, is not a matter of if you're going to do it, but when you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. But to take that a little bit further, it becomes clear to us that the role that religion plays in society is definitely having an impact on people and interactions in the workplace. And so we were scheduled to have a fireside chat to start our day with Arno Michaelis, who is joining us today. And so I'm grateful that we were still able to schedule this and do this in this way. To introduce Arno very briefly, he is the author of My Life After Hate, as well as the co-author of The Gift of Our Wounds. And I realized this morning, I was trying to think about it, that we've actually known each other now for about 5 years. And it has just been an amazing journey, just getting to know you and watching your journey. And I wanted to start this conversation because something interesting that came up as we were preparing for this is you talked about your life as a practicing Buddhist today, and that informs your work around peace as much as, if not more than, your former life as a white supremacist. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that how do you see the impact of being a person who is a Buddhist today on the kind of world stage, the pandemic, and all of the things that we're dealing with?
Well, thank you, Mark. It's been an honor and a pleasure getting to know you as well over these years, and I'm grateful to you and everyone at Tanenbaum for the work that you do, first and foremost, and for making this conversation happen today. My Buddhist faith is very much a pillar of everything I do. I don't believe I would have been able to work in the peace building field for the past decade were it not for my meditation practice, for the support of the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and the Sangha of our broader Buddhist community. And during the pandemic times, I think a lot about, and you had just mentioned it also, that normal. Like, is this the new normal? Is this a transition? Those things are really like the foundation of Dharma and the foundation of the Buddhist teachings, in that we can very easily become habitualized to habits that kind of deaden our connection with the world. And therefore the belief that we can habitually repair those habits to be ones that connect us with the world. That's really what Buddhism's all about. So as we're living through this pandemic, and the idea of what is normal and what's not is very much up in play now. It's up for grabs, and it could go in all sorts of directions. I think it's a great time to remind ourselves that normal is going to be what we practice. So if practice is front and center, Dharma 101. Practice shapes a human life the same way a water dripping on a stone would. A little drop of water can eventually crack a big boulder in half. It just takes enough drops and enough time to do it. So if we condition ourselves to look at our fellow human beings as family and as people that we care about as much as our immediate family, and be mindful about the impact that we have on the world around us, not just other human beings, but the planet as well. And we see that as a habit to develop and practice. That's a way that we can normalize connection and normalize mindfulness and thoughtfulness. And I really believe that at this point in human history, it's going to be imperative to do that for us to continue to progress as a species.
Well, this is a really great place to start then, because, given what we see, and so one of the things that we were noticing, and it was kind of clear to see, is that prior to the pandemic, if we go back to the fall of last year, even the summer of last year, we began to see increased levels of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, of homophobia, etc., globally. But particularly anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, we definitely saw heightened incidents, and not just desecration of sacred sites, but more incidences of people physically being assaulted. And then we had COVID-19, and now we add to this poison pot the rising xenophobia against Asians and people perceived to be Asian. So given, if we look at this from the perspective of practice, what do you think are some of the practices that are up for investigation now that we're in the midst of this pandemic, or at least that the pandemic has started to shine a light on in a slightly different way?
That's a fantastic question. I think my first thought is that certainty is such an interesting element of the way we think and the way that we look at the world. We human beings have a kind of a natural tendency to want to be certain about things, and especially when there's trauma. And whether the trauma is a pandemic or it's a new family moving in next door to you that you don't know, whenever the uncertainty is filling our world, we're going to be like hungry for some kind of certainty to make sense of it. And as far as a practice goes, we're very acclimated to that. We zoom to certainty like a magnet, and I think there's a lot of thoughtless action there where you're not even thinking about it. You're like, oh, yeah, that's an easy explanation. That makes sense. I want to hear something that makes sense. Cool. Done. if we were to look at that as a practice and perhaps not the healthiest of practices, we could counter it with a practice to say, well, you know, I don't know, and that's okay. I think it's really important for the health of an individual, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, as well as the health of a society in those same aspects, to be able to find comfort in uncertainty. That's kind of a best case scenario. It takes a lot of practice to get to that point. But maybe if not just comfort, but we can exist in uncertainty without kind of becoming hostile and without being traumatized by the lack of certainty. And to me, this pandemic is a fantastic opportunity for that, as is day-to-day human life. But the pandemic certainly times 10. There's so much uncertainty that it's really become a survival mechanism that we find some way to exist in this uncertainty without lashing out.
Yeah. So this is inspiring a couple of questions. I've been trying to take notes so that I can remember them, because now I'm at the age where I don't remember. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about your own experiences with uncertainty, and what were some of the ways in which that uncertainty kind of fed disconnection from people. And why don't we start there?
Sure. It's interesting going back and looking at my life. I had certainty in many things that I took for granted as a child. I had certainty that I was going to eat every day. I had certainty that I had two parents who loved me. I had certainty that I lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I didn't really have to worry about crime. I didn't have to worry about my safety. And I'm the kind of like messed up person to where that was like not comfortable for me. And so I'm going to create some uncertainty to like kind of as an antidote to all this certainty that I had. And I did that by lashing out at other kids, by being a bully on the school bus. And I think like the uncomfortable uncertainty in my childhood really had to do with my father's alcoholism. At the same time, though, it's on me how I responded to that. I never want to say like, oh, it's my dad's fault that I made these mistakes. It's no one's fault but mine. I'm the one who made these decisions. And looking back, I understand that my father was doing the best that he could at the time, and alcoholism is a disease, and it's one that he still struggles with today. And despite his difficulties, he was always there for me. And he was a big factor in me getting out of the white nationalist movement, as well as a factor in my childhood trauma. And that's a life lesson. Life's complex. There's very rarely times where you have like a very clear definition of this is the good guy, the bad guy, it's your fault, I'm the victim. It's almost always a lot more complex than that. And I think in that complexity, there's definitely an uncertainty. When you have it's hard to get your head around all this complexity. So it behooves us to see this situation as uncertain. But I don't think I was aware of any of this as a kid. Everything I do now is like Monday morning psychoanalysis of myself as a child, to be like, well, why did I do this? Why did I do that? Why did I go wrong at this stage? What could have diverted me at that stage? And so I think my behavior as a child was a reaction to what I saw as boring certainties in my life. And I understand what a privilege it is for me to be able to say that. I understand today that there are literally like billions of children on this planet who would have felt like they won the lottery if they traded childhoods with me. But the important thing to understand is that suffering is a subjective thing. It's a relative thing. And as a kid, I wasn't aware of how good I had it, and what a gift it was to have certainty of things like food and shelter and safety. And I think that's kind of a repeating pattern when you see violent ideologies popping up in modern society, where it's people they're like, oh, this is so bad and that's so bad. It's like, well, yeah, actually, you got a lot to be grateful for, and but again, that's a natural human thing. We're not real thoughtful when we're traumatized. That's just something that human beings do, and I think that's kind of how uncertainty led me to the point where white nationalism seemed to make sense.
And it's interesting because, I hear in this discussion about uncertainty, which I do think, one of the things I've been speaking to some people about is the idea that we've experienced, I certainly have experienced uncertainty in other times in my life and with different things. And then it almost seems kind of like there's a spectrum of that uncertainty. Like there's uncertainty and I'm not sure how it's going to go. And then there's uncertainty where I'm afraid. And that and that's just two examples of a much longer, wider spectrum of experience. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, one, does that resonate? And then I guess two, where do we make the connection between the experience of uncertainty that moves into fear, that then moves into action against others?
Yeah, that absolutely resonates. It's very interesting. I'm thinking as you were saying that, when we're faced with uncertainty, you basically, not to be certain about this, but you basically have two options. You can, if you're uncertain, you can like reach for certainty, one form or another, the nearest certainty you can find, like a drowning man trying to get a gasp of air, or you can like sit in the uncertainty and just be with it and kind of surrender to it, which is far more difficult, far more counterintuitive, but also I think far more productive as far as our work on ourselves to be better people. I think the place that uncertainty can translate into fear and then into violence is when we're too desperate to look for that, whatever the closest certainty we can find is. Because as people are traumatized and you want to place blame, you want to point fingers, you want to kind of put your finger on something and say, this is the cause of my trauma. That's an easy way out as far as the certainty goes. And again, it makes us kind of ignore the complexities involved and look for that simple answer. And that being said, I'm a big fan of simple answers in other ways. To me, the simple answer to all the problems we face as human beings is that we need to see ourselves in others. And we need to see others in ourselves. If we can simply do that, that is a foundation to really solve all the other problems we face as human beings. But of course, it's so much easier said than done. So the need to look for a simple answer, maybe we just say, well, there are simple answers out there, but it's not necessarily the first one that we're going to find. So maybe we got to shop around and finding our certainty. And in order to do that, we have to create some space within that uncertainty to where we can exist in it for at least long enough to consider what these other options of certainty are being presented to us.
Yeah. I think, one of the things that I hear in what you're sharing is that simply the simplest answer is not necessarily going to be the easiest one to implement. Like there could be like an answer right before us, but that doesn't mean that we actually have the capacity to do it.
Great point. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I guess, one of the things I'd like to pivot the conversation ever so slightly, because the majority of people who are joining us today work in some way or are connected in some way to efforts around diversity and equity and inclusion in their companies. And in particular, they are connected to Tanenbaum or have heard about us because of our work around addressing religious diversity in corporations. And our kind of like guiding principle, the thing if it were achieved, we would go out of business, was that, you know, every employee around the world would know that their beliefs and their practices, religious or not, were respected by their employer. That's the foundation of why we do everything that we do. So there is uncertainty in the world of business. We have unprecedented numbers of people who are unemployed or who are furloughed temporarily. We have all of the impacts of COVID, and then we have everything that people were dealing with before COVID-19. So, you know, sending children to school and, you know, thinking about their retirement and all of the things that were part of the questions people were asking themselves before. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the conversation we've had thus far. How does this actually can be of value for companies to think about how to strengthen or even continue to make the case for diverse and equitable, inclusive workforces where people feel like they belong?
I'm reminded of my own personal faith journey, which I'm 49 now, and I was about 38 or 39 before I saw any sort of value in Christianity. But my entire life, up until that point, I had been vehemently opposed to Christianity from every angle you can imagine. As a kid, it was just part of my, I could poke at society by messing with this sacred convention. So that was my first kind of dipping my toes in opposing Christianity. As a white nationalist, of which there's many factions, some of whom claim to be Christian, which I still find puzzling as I did back then. But as a white nationalist, I saw Christianity as like this active program to kill white people by making them docile and loving their enemies and turning the other cheek. And so I hated Christianity as much as I hated anybody else as a white nationalist. I went from being a white nationalist within a couple of years, being a man of extremes. I immersed myself in the rave scene on the south side of Chicago and in the Midwest. And in the rave scene, I made friends with a lot of gay people. And so during the 2004 election, the 2000 election, I was very upset with what I saw as the Christian right for being anti-LGBT. So now I've despised Christianity as a racist, years later I'm despising it as someone who is an advocate for LGBT people. And it wasn't until I was 38, 39 years old when studying Dharma and Buddhism really started to make sense to me. And I had this, like, I'm reading some Buddhist book and I'm like, oh, if everyone were a Buddhist, there'd be world peace. And I wanted to like grab people by the collar and be like, have you heard the good news about the Buddha? And no, I'm like, who do I sound like now? I sound like all these Christian people that I've despised and belittled my entire life, when really they're excited about the teachings of Jesus Christ and they just want to spread that good news to everyone. And it hit me at that point that human spirituality is really just connection with what's best about being a human in the process of dealing with what's worst of being a human. So if any form of human spirituality helps us engage with being loving, forgiving, kind, compassionate, it's a good thing. There literally cannot be too many ways of doing that. And since opening myself like that, I've become massively inspired by the teachings of Jesus Christ, as well as inspired by Judaism, inspired by Islam. I'm hugely inspired by Sikhi to the point where I've tattooed Sikhi stuff on my body. And it's just, personally, it's such a gift to me to be in this mode where I'm not only inspired, but curious about other forms of human spirituality than my own. And I'm curious because every time I sit and listen to a Christian, or I listen to a Jew, or I listen to a Muslim, and they tell me about their spirituality, it helps me connect deeper with mine. So it is like self-serving in a sense, but it helps me be the best person I can be. And if I'm a member of an organization, if I'm a member of a company, this help me to be the best member of that organization that I can be. And therefore it helps to build the success of the organization. So this is it's a win-win situation to not only where I'm not disconnecting myself from this other person, but by connecting with them and by acknowledging their faith and seeing the value in it, I'm helping them feel comfortable as well. Just like as you made plain in your mission statement there, that's similar to my mission statement. Right, I want a society where everyone is valued and included, to where people feel like they can be their authentic selves at work as well as at home.
And so this is really interesting because one of the things that I know that companies can often be concerned about is the experience of anyone proselytizing to another person. And I'm not suggesting that that's what you're doing or what you're talking about, but there's this concern that as an institution, working in this field for 28 years, there's this concern that if there is some kind of structured, open, acknowledged conversation about people's various, and I love the language of human spirituality, I'm stealing that, and this is being recorded, so, if you hear me say it and I don't attribute, then you'll know that
it's not a trademark, so
you have
everything I have to say is just universal knowledge anyway, so.
But I do think that there's something to be said for, how do we continue to till the soil, if you will, and make environments safe enough for people to feel that they can share, that they can explore that curiosity that they have, as well as to be comfortable not being curious, but then also not being offensive. So what do you think about that?
Well, it is a fine line, and I think it brings to mind for me something that's always front and center, and it's essentially compassion. And I think the relationship between passion and compassion is very interesting. Being in what we call the Western world, like we're kind of all about passion. All of our social mythology is about passion. We want to be passionate about our jobs. We want to be passionate about our goals. We want to be passionate about our faith. We want to be passionate about our activism and our relationships. It's all passion, passion, passion. But in Eastern philosophy, and that's a very broad brush, but specifically in Buddhism, passion is seen as problematic. Passion is what blinds us to the suffering of other people. And it can actually be a root of violence. So for me, being a product of the West, like everybody here is, it's a matter of balancing passion with compassion. And compassion is, by its nature, unconditional. Compassion doesn't mean that my heart bleeds for people I'm sympathetic to, but then slam shut the people that I'm not. That's passion. And that's an easy example of how violence can be founded by passion. Compassion is seeing a situation, you're seeing violence happen, and you're understanding that not only is the victim suffering, but the perpetrators are suffering also. Otherwise, they wouldn't be acting like that. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's hard for me to swallow in many circumstances, but I get myself to the point where I can swallow that pill by just reminding myself that the only, here I am being certain again. I remind myself that, here's a better way to put it. Compassion is the healthiest approach to these problems that we face. So if we're talking about interactions in a workplace between people of different religious backgrounds, and we approach that from a compassionate place. And we first of all, this is very easy in the Abrahamic faith. You see the roots of compassion in all three of these great faiths. In fact, I think of the holy books of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, that there's probably more talk about compassion and forgiveness and love than anything else. So you can see that common ground in compassion. And you can also see when you connect with an individual on a faith level, you can sometimes get their story of how their faith has helped them to move through trauma that they're actively enduring or that they have been through. And when you can talk about that personal trauma, again, compassion is a super powerful venue for that conversation to happen. So I think to interfaith workplace dynamics, compassion is a great solution, as it is on many other levels.
Wow. It's so funny because I didn't realize that we were going to be talking about this. And one of the things that we have that we've been developing over a number of years are these things that we call shared visions. And so many people are familiar with the one that we've created around the golden rule, which is, how the golden rule or treating others the way you would like to be treated is expressed through a variety of religious traditions. But we also have a shared vision on compassion. So it occurs to me that we should, Cameron, I'm sure you can hear me. If you can find the link to that, maybe you can share that in the chat box for people at some point before we complete, because what's interesting is that I love this distinction between compassion and passion. And when I think about, if I'm having a conversation with any of our corporate members or corporate clients, and I begin to speak with them about, well, what we really should be focusing on is compassion, then that can often land as a soft skill, or it's too woo-woo, or
right.
the work that needs to be done, etc. Right. But I'd love to, if there were another, or what would be the synonyms for compassion that I think could be useful in corporate work around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm reminded of another anecdote, which I'll try to be brief with, but I do intervention work as well as broader peace building work, which means I speak with people who are actively in hate groups, and I help them to change their lives around. And there was one incident where I'm talking to a guy who's in the Ku Klux Klan, and he's coming at me with just raging hostility, and he's just racial slurs left and right. And it's really angers me on all sorts of levels. For one, it angers me to stare my old self in the face. It's very uncomfortable. I don't want to deal with that. He's making me angry by putting me through this. I'm on the verge of going old school Arno on him. But what really just about put me over the edge is today, and for the past 20 years or so, some of the most important people in my life are people of color who have been dehumanized by this language that I've used myself for over 500 years. And so when I hear that language from someone, it enrages me to the point where it's all I can do to restrain myself from physical violence. So I take a breath as this guy's like, rah, rah, rah. I take a breath, and I feel the breath come in through my nostrils. And in connecting with my breath, I disconnect myself from his hostility, but then connect to his suffering. And I remind myself the reason he's acting like this is because something is seriously wrong in his life. And that making him suffer further is not going to make him any better, and it's not going to improve this situation. So I'm thinking tactically. This isn't just like a kumbaya, okay, compassion's great, guys, just do it. It's actually a tactical tool to restore control of this myself, basically, in this interaction to myself rather than to him. And that certainly comes up in the workplace left and right. Hopefully not on this level of drama, but the bottom line is by disconnecting myself from his hostility, using compassion and mindfulness. I was able to ultimately reach this guy who burned his clan robe. His leader of his clan group burned his clan robe, and now the entire clan group no longer exists. And this gentleman, whose name is Chris Buckley, is currently working alongside me at Parents for Peace to help de-radicalize people. And specifically, Chris is developing a program to overcome addiction to hate. And he's taken a lead on it. And so I've seen this man make this huge transformation. I've seen his children follow him in transformation. And this all happened because of a tactical, almost weaponized compassion. So I think we're leaving a lot of power on the table if we don't understand what compassion can do for us.
And I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of the first person account and the first person engagement, which is that, we talk a lot about one of our tools for respectful communication, and really has become a foundational point in a lot of our work, is that you can manage people's behavior, but you cannot manage their beliefs. And people are free to believe as they will, but the ways in which we interact with one another, we can ask for and create workspaces that have guidelines, if you will, for what is the expected behavior when you encounter someone who you differ with, whether it's around religious identity, any other aspect of identity, the way in which work is done. What are the guardrails for that? And I do think that it is very much a first person kind of approach. Like, what can I do in this situation? And then how do I share that with others?
Absolutely. And again, it's just such a great occasion for tactical compassion. Going back to certainty, in the interaction I just described, I was certain at this point I'm about to put my fist through this guy's head. That was certainly what I wanted to do for an instant. And it was compassion that created space for different possibilities to exist. So again, compassion is a tactical tool that we can use in our interactions with fellow human beings. And there's perhaps nowhere that it's more powerful than in the workplace, because it not only can transform the relationships between two individuals, but it can transform the management process and what management looks like. It can transform leadership. And it can also transform your day-to-day work of everyone at all levels of the organization. And it's free. it's just it's a practice sitting there waiting for us to take it up. And once we do, it becomes incredibly transformative to the point where people's beliefs can sort themselves out. If you can introduce compassion as a practice. And in my intervention process, it's another technique I use, is I'm not going to butt heads about somebody about macro political issues. Yes, this guy said that, or they did that, whatever. I'm just going to try to introduce the beauty of compassion into their lives by modeling it myself. And then once they can pick that up and see how great it is for them personally, it takes them in all those directions.
Wow. Well, that's great. So I can see we could just chat on and on and on and use up the whole hour. But I'm sure that there very well may be questions that people have. So I am not I think Arno, right now you are the host right now.
I'm the host. Okay.
You're the host.
Welcome, everyone.
Can you make me the host, just so that I can
let me see.
Or not even worrying about that. Well, whatever. I'm not sure.
Oh. You are the host, Mark.
Fantastic. Okay.
I'm also a former IT guy.
And I'm glad you are, because I am truly not. I am truly not. We want to open up this now so that people can actually, if you have questions, you can ask your questions. You should, on I think the bottom of the participants list, be able to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And there's one that's here that's mentioned in the chat box, which I'm just going to try and recreate. This is from Jeremy, so thank you for this. I appreciate this conversation about certainty. Although I know it wasn't explicitly mentioned, it seems to me that interest in conspiracy theories seems deeply connected to this demand for certainty, and conspiracy theories are deeply connected to hate. Do you have advice as to what workplaces can do to address the rising problem of attachment to conspiracy theories, especially considering conspiracy theories are sometimes connected to one's religious view?
Excellent, excellent question. And I've been focusing on this area quite a bit, just in the nature of counterviolent extremism and peace building for 10 years, but especially in response to the pandemic. There's a brilliant author named Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote a book called Sapiens, a couple other really big books. I just watched a thing where he was talking about conspiracy theories, and he put it really well. He's just like, we don't like feeling stupid. Like, human beings don't like feeling stupid. So if there's some huge problem, and again, it's very, very complex, and we look at it like, I don't know. It's intimidating to look at this problem. And then somebody comes on and goes, no, this is what's going on. This is what's really happening. Now we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense now. So now it not only answers our need for certainty, it answers our need to like not feel stupid. So it's very, again, it's an easy way out. It's an easy option for someone who's in a situation of trauma. And trauma is very conducive to conspiracy theories. The more traumatized we are, the more we tend to revert to binary thinking. Yes, no, black, white, good, evil. And conspiracy theories are very much built on that binary. Every single conspiracy theory, as a former proponent of them, has the good guy and the bad guy, the ominous threat, and who's being threatened by it. It's to me, I look at it as a habit. It's a habit like smoking cigarettes or drinking beer. It's a crutch that and we're all susceptible to this. So it's I think an important step one is to not look down on anybody who is under the influence of a conspiracy theory and think any less of them, and understand this is a natural human response to trauma that they're going through. But then to also understand that it's not a healthy thing to believe in these kind of conspiracy theories. And again, the answer to this is introducing the truth of complexity, saying there's a lot more involved in this than just Bill Gates and his vaccinations and microchips. And then beyond that, really, and it's interesting too that a lot of conspiracy theories kind of present like they're coming from a place of compassion. Like, wow. I'm against Bill Gates because I don't want everyone to be enslaved and microchipped and subject to his evil, insidious vaccine. Like, I'm doing this for a common good. And I think again, that's a very encouraging sign. That's something we can work with. So if somebody's has a conspiracy theory and they seem to be coming into it from a place of compassion, let's take that compassion and find a healthy, like, legitimate outlet for it. I run a project called Serve to Unite, which does arts-driven service learning, and service is such an amazing vehicle for that. If you can, and this is a fantastic opportunity for business organizations to have an internal service effort. Our organization, Serve to Unite, does that. We started out working in schools. We've worked in schools for 8 years. We're now gearing to deliver our service program directly to businesses as well. And in this way, we can take people who again, it's a big challenge. Like people are, I'm concerned about all of humanity. That's why I'm opposed to Bill Gates. Okay, well, what if we went out and we have this company-wide initiative to help homeless veterans in our area, and we'd love for you to come join us. Like, let's put some energy into this. Again, not necessarily telling them that they're wrong about Bill Gates or whatever, but just redirecting that compassion into a place where it can grow in a healthy way and lead them to be a little have a little room in the uncertainty to find certainties other than the conspiracy theory.
Yeah, that's great. You know, one of the things I was making a couple of notes because I do think that there's something important to say about the complexity and the role of trauma and generational trauma, historic trauma, that conspiracy theories don't necessarily don't just present themselves. In many instances, it's kind of like, there are 7 stories to be told in the world, and our conspiracy theories often kind of refer to those. But I do think that they are also rooted in actual trauma that people have experienced from a variety of identifiers, including being people who are perhaps either religious minorities or who've been, and that goes across all denominations and all traditions. But the experience that people have not been heard or seen or have actually been victimized. So one of the things I think can also contribute is to continue to find ways to tell people stories or to let people tell their own story about their own trauma or their experience and why it is they feel the way that they do. Like what's the root of that disconnection from other people? I think that, and I know that a number of companies are making spaces like that, have been making spaces like that for African American and Pan-African people to be talking about their experiences as people of color, and for LGBTQIA people to be telling their experiences. So I think more of that is necessary than less. We shouldn't like raise our foot off the pedal of that, so that people can actually kind of see the spectrum of understanding of it. And facts make a difference. I do think that facts make a difference. It just in terms of presenting it for discussion, not for agreement per se.
Right. Yeah, that's the trauma-informed aspect of it is absolutely crucial. And again, you're right. I think the more unprocessed trauma a person has in their life, the more ripe they are to latch on to a conspiracy theory.
We've got another question, Arno, which is, are there specific trainings available on compassion?
Yeah, my go-to workshop actually is I organize a group of people in what I call mindful listening pairs, and give an instruction how one of the pair will speak for a period of 5 minutes and the other pair will do nothing but listen. And the topic is talk about a time in your life when you were hurt or when you hurt someone else. And so very often those two things will both co-present in the same experience. And ideally, when I conduct this workshop, I want to have in the pairs people who don't know each other. So if you have people that don't know each other and they're sitting down, and I always tell them, like, you don't have to like unearth your deepest, darkest secret that you're going to go to pieces about, but at the same time, the deeper and darker you go, the more you're going to get out of this exercise. And reliably, and I've done this probably 100 times all over the world with like every kind of group from middle school kids to cops in Denmark. And almost every time people just kind of naturally really do talk about some very traumatic things they've been through in their lives. I've had a lot of participants in this workshop say, I've never told that to anybody, or I've never told that to anyone outside my family, and now I just told it to a complete stranger. And to sit and listen to someone share that experience with you, and then to reciprocate and share an experience of your own, it's an incredible way to cultivate compassion and to really show the power of it. My litmus test on this workshop, and I swear I'm not a sadist, the litmus test is tears. And tears in Buddhism are part of something we call bodhicitta, which is awakened heart. The way to describe bodhicitta is like just that feeling of tears welling up. right before one actually falls, that feeling of we're just like, the emotions coming at you, and to see that evoked of participants in this workshop over and over and over again, like that is real live compassion, and it's a connection for people to see the power of it and to carry forward from the actual workshop into their day-to-day work lives and home lives.
And can you say again, what is the name of that activity where the people are working in pairs? What do you call that?
It's called a dyad. And actually, if you go to our website at serve2unite.org with the number 2, we have all this. I'll try to bring up the link for everyone. We have all of this available. We have a PDF that describes the dyad process, and our participants today are welcome to visit our website and use all the curriculum we have. It's all open source, and it's all used for everyone. And I'm pasting the link now.
Oh, great.
Within this curriculum page, you'll see individual lessons, but then you'll see toolkit. There's one that says toolkit dyads, and that details how to set up the 2-person mindful storytelling and listening exercise. And the really cool thing about it is that while the exploring the subject of hurt is super powerful, and we've done that all the time, you can conceivably use this exercise for any kind of topic.
Right.
Like, and if you wanted to, if there's a contentious topic in your company, we have a management team, should we expand, should we not expand? You could take that if and make that the topic of it. So you can use it in all sorts of circumstances, and I invite everybody to have at it.
Fantastic. So we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask, you can either raise your hand, which I think I can see if you're raising your hand, or you can put your question into the chat box. There's also a Q&A box, and you can post your questions there. While we're just waiting for any other questions to come in, though, Arno, let me ask you this, kind of shooting towards the end of our hour. Based on our conversation, and maybe having nothing to do with our conversation, but just what's present and mindful for you right now, what would you say is the one thing you would want the diversity and equity and inclusion practitioners who are on this call with us now to remember after we've left one another?
I think especially for the D&I crowd, it's imperative to always make space for possibilities outside of our preconceived certainties. Theoretically, that's what D&I is all about, and I love D&I, but I've seen D&I practitioners who like come into it with a very, very rigid idea of like, this is how you have to toe this line in order to truly be effective at D&I. And what ends up happening is that people who really need to be reached with the truth of how powerful and beautiful diversity and inclusion are, they just shut down. So I think when we get ourselves in a situation where we're saying, certain people can say or think this, but other people can't say this and can't think that according to their skin color. Like, this is, I don't think that serves the purposes of D&I. I think anytime we have a rigid approach to something and we have a closed approach where there isn't possibilities and there isn't openness, we could do a lot more harm than good. And that's something that we really can't afford to make that mistake in the D&I field. So I think just being open to possibilities other than the kind of D&I 101 approach that's kind of come to be over the past decade or so.
Thank you. I think that that's important. And As it seems that we do not have any additional questions at this time, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. We kind of talked briefly about what we were going to talk about, and clearly we didn't talk about any of that today, which was awesome because I really do feel like the conversation kind of naturally evolved into what it was supposed to be today. And
Absolutely.
Given, I said at the beginning that our theme for the summit this year was the world around us. And I think if nothing else we can all agree on is that there is certainly a need for us to be mindful of our passions as we go through this experience with COVID-19 and every other social crisis that we're dealing with. But additionally, it's really important for us to strengthen and develop and expand our capacity for compassion for ourselves as well as for other people. I do believe that those are intrinsic ideas within diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that all of the people who've joined us today and those who will listen afterward, I think will be encouraged by this conversation. So I want to thank you, Arno, so much for making yourself available. I want to remind everyone that we are having our virtual gala tonight. We will have about a 15-minute virtual cocktail reception on Zoom. And then separate from the Zoom link, we are actually, we'll be producing a live stream event, which will be our virtual gala, that will run from 5:50 to 7 p.m. And that also, the pre-show that starts at 5:50 will include some information about Tanenbaum, but we've also got some don't rush challenges that I don't think that you want to miss. There's one that's the clear winner, and I'm not going to say any more about that, but you will find yourself kind of rolling around in your own home in laughter, and you can laugh as loud as you want. But I do encourage you, if you've not already purchased tickets or made yourself, found a way for you to be with us for the virtual gala tonight, please do so. Thank you all for joining us and for engaging us in these conversations. And we will talk again soon. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.